Final Fantasy is having a bit of a moment right now. With the meteoric rise of support for Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy VII Remake actually delivering on the hype, we're starting to see the brand get more recognition than it has in a long time. This is basically a new golden age for Final Fantasy. And with that attention comes people who have never played the Final Fantasy games, and their first entry into the series is Final Fantasy XIV or Final Fantasy VII's remake. And the question that inevitably gets asked is, what Final Fantasy should be my first outside of those? It's a question I've often been asked from friends, family, and acquaintances, and I've thought really long and hard about it. And honestly, there's not a super solid one-size-fits-all answer. With 15 core games and a handful of spin-offs, getting into Final Fantasy can appear to be a daunting task. Even if the games aren't necessarily connected through their narratives, they do share thematic elements that build over time, and it's easy to get overwhelmed trying to navigate where to start your exploration. While a lot of people might think that the logical first place to start is the beginning, I honestly tend to recommend staying away from the first two Final Fantasy titles, at least when you're first dipping your toes into the waters. Final Fantasy I and II have not aged particularly well and haven't been given the same love and attention that later titles have received in the way of ports. Truth be told, these games aren't exactly the best representation of what Final Fantasy became either. You can see kernels here and there, but overall they play drastically different and feel much more dated and generic in their RPG style. Realistically, I would say that the only real reason to play the first two games is after you've played the rest and you want to experience where it all began. Both games have pieces that eventually evolved in mechanics and themes used in other games, but on their own, they don't typically stand up like the other titles do. The first title I would actually look at to potentially recommend to newcomers to the franchise is Final Fantasy III. No, not that 3. This 3. One of the more confusing aspects of Final Fantasy numbering is that the West got games released out of order. In the West, the numbering went 1, 2, 3, 7. In actuality, what we got were 1, 4, 6, and 7. Eventually, all the missed titles were released in the West under their correct name, but for those who grew up with the games, it still causes some confusion. Now, back to Final Fantasy III. This game, in my opinion, is the first benchmark for what the series would become. One of the hallmarks of early Final Fantasy was the job system, being able to train your party in specific classes and swap them around for whatever you needed at the time. It was a neat feature that gave the player the power to customize their combat experience and how they would tackle the game's bosses. It also heavily focuses on the Warriors of Light concept and saving the world from darkness. What I will say about this game is that it is not easy. One of the reasons it was initially skipped for Western release was that it was deemed too hard for US-based gamers. It's not an impossible game, but it does require a fair bit of grinding, and the job system can be a little daunting if you don't have a plan or aren't prepared. I thoroughly enjoyed 3, but ultimately I don't think I'd recommend it for your first Final Fantasy game to explore either, because it is flawed in some very specific ways. Final Fantasy IV, originally 2 in the West, is a milestone title in the franchise. It breaks away from the job system and instead gives you characters with defined roles. Some characters come and go through different story beats to help you give an edge here and there, but ultimately your party is set in their roles and abilities. 4 is also the first, in my opinion, to tell a truly epic story focused around strong characters and their personal story arcs. Where 3 was the quintessential fun romp with the Warriors of Light, 4 is a lot darker and deals with a lot heavier subject matter. It definitely sets the tone for what is to come with later titles in that regard. To date, this is still one of my favorite stories told in video games. The characters are fleshed out extremely well and facilitate a connection to the story that most games, especially in that era, couldn't match. I'm going to cut right to the chase for Final Fantasy V. The biggest knock I have against it is that it's forgettable. There's nothing inherently awful about the game, but there's nothing that stands out from the game either. Honestly, the most memorable part of the game is this. The job system returns for this title, and for some that might be reason enough to check it out, but to me it just doesn't have enough power to stand up on its own two legs. The tone of the story is a far cry from 4. It doesn't have near the weight and overall heaviness, and in fact this game goes out of its way to be lighter and more comedic. It doesn't even do a remarkable job at making it work either. This, to me, falls more in line with 1 and 2, where it could probably be skipped entirely, except by those who want to play through the entire franchise. The combat is fine and there are a decent amount of in-game options, but overall it just doesn't do anything extraordinary to warrant prioritizing it. While Final Fantasy IV was the first game to really explore characters and story in a meaningful way, Final Fantasy VI took that and ran with it. There are so many memorable moments from this game, from the characters and story to the music that fills the background. This is one of the strongest titles of the franchise, and some believe it to be the best game out of the entire series. This also marks our first steps away from the high fantasy settings from the previous 5 games. It's more gritty and steampunk, putting more focus on machines and technology as part of the world. That's not to say the other entries lacked technology. Airships have long been a staple of the series at this point, but this takes a giant technological leap forward for the setting. Everything about this game is a giant step forward for the series, and while it's not my personal favorite, I can see why people have this as their number 1. This game is almost too good for me to recommend for players who are new to the series, because quite honestly, I don't know that it can live up to the hype, and by entering at this point, that could turn you off from the whole series. And it's for that same reason that I would say Final Fantasy VII should be avoided as well. It is probably the biggest and most hyped iteration of the series. It was probably the first Final Fantasy for a lot of people, and that's why it has such a strong nostalgic tie for people. It continues where 6 left off, and once again we leave behind the high fantasy roots for something more gritty and advanced. While we have left the job system behind yet again, the materia system does enable the players to somewhat customize their party to however they desire. With the remake here and receiving rave reviews, I think this is a title that has a logical first step for exploration. We already know that the remake is changing the narrative elements, so while you wait for the rest of the episodes to come out, why not experience the original? But as I have previously stated, I think there is too much hype around 7 and 6 for it to be a starting off point, because if it does not meet your expectations from that hype, it likely sours your entire thoughts on the series as a whole. This also marks the start of the series beginning to jump the shark narratively. This story is easily the most convoluted thus far, and it only gets more deranged from here with crazy plots. It's not quite Kingdom Hearts, but it is the beginning of the slippery slope. On the heels of what was such a monumental success, Final Fantasy VIII had a lot of expectations heaped upon it. Once again, we're staying away from the high fantasy and using a more technologically advanced setting, albeit this time not as grimdark as the Midgar setting. The story we get is massive and focused more on introspection and romance than any title had up until this point. Sure, 7 had its fair share of edge and romance, but 8 was on an entirely different level. If you were a scene or emo kid growing up, then I speak pretty confidently that you'll probably like this Final Fantasy entry. It's more human-centered than big bad world-ending set-piece drama. And while that's not what people were expecting, it did a lot to win people over. It has a lot of memorable music and characters that at the end of the day make it an interesting pickup, but I wouldn't point to it as your jumping off point, as it is pretty different from the series as a whole and is pretty controversial in how it changed up the Final Fantasy formula. After the previous 3 games, it was time for a reset. Final Fantasy IX is a love letter to the series and returns the series to its roots of high fantasy. 9 is one of my absolute favorite games in the series. The music, the characters, and the story, all of it creates a really memorable experience that I think gets overshadowed because of where it fell in release. At the end of the PS1 life cycle, and just a year before Final Fantasy X on the PS2. This game does so much right to encapsulate the essence of the series. The story does more to focus on your entire cast of characters and really give them their own character arcs that are weaved into the story, unlike previous titles where character development was relegated to certain compartmentalized moments. The overall tone of 9 is a bit cheerier, reminiscent of 5, except it actually nails it and manages to create a really in-depth story while not going down the rabbit hole of Edge. It has some problems in pacing and combat, but overall is a super solid entry to the series and one that should absolutely be on your radar to play and experience. However, because it is such a love letter to the franchise, it's self-referential, and I don't think it's a great jumping in point for somebody who's just exploring the franchise for the first time. Final Fantasy X. It's hard for me to be objective on this one because Final Fantasy X is my favorite game of all time, let alone favorite Final Fantasy title. Everything about this game is nostalgic and heartwarming and familiar to me. Writing the script, I have goosebumps just thinking about the game and how much it means to me and how much I love it. I am, however, able to recognize its faults and why many do not like the title. I simply don't care about those shortcomings because the experience more than outweighs their negatives. Final Fantasy X is much like 7 in that it is a lot of people's first Final Fantasy. It wasn't my direct first, but it was the first I actually played to completion. Much like 9, each character goes through a ton of development as part of the main story, and while the story can get a little convoluted, it's pretty compelling and never fails to give me the feels. The sphere grid system is really interesting and enables you to customize your characters and party to your desires. While it's not a full-blown job system, it is very robust, and with the International and HD Remake editions, it does let you have free control over how you build your characters out. If you want Tidus and Wakka to be your mages, while Yuna and Lulu are your frontline tanks, you can absolutely do that. Final Fantasy XI and XIV are both MMOs, and I'm not really going to dive into those titles as they're not really in the same vein as the other mainline titles. I will say that if you are a fan of MMOs and you have not played 14, give it a shot because it's a very fun experience. It took some time for them to get there, but it's definitely worth checking out these days and is honestly setting a new gold standard for MMOs. Final Fantasy XII catches a lot of flack because of its main character. Vaughn is a bit of a blank slate, and that's by design. He and his female counterpart, Penelo, are the proxies for the player. And if you could accept that, you'll probably enjoy this story. This is the first title to really go back to the job system, and while X's Sphere Grid essentially does the same, each character was locked to their equipment types, so while abilities are able to be transferred, their weapons cannot. 12, on the other hand, lets you completely customize your party however you want. The Zodiac Age takes this a step further by allowing characters to have 2 jobs so that you can mix and match martial and magical jobs to create a further rounded party. The story also leans really heavily into the political intrigue plots, and at the time of release, that turned some people away. I'll admit when I first played it, I was too young to really appreciate and understand the nuances of the story, but every subsequent playthrough as I got older, I fell in love with its themes more and more. What lends itself even more to the story is that Ivalice is a shared setting across multiple games and titles. Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy Tactics, and, depending on what your view is, Vagrant Story is also supposedly set in the same universe. Ivalice is easily one of my favorite settings in all of Final Fantasy, and the way that 12 specifically lets you explore the world is pretty unique. There's an entire side quest chain where you're a bounty hunter taking on dangerous marks out in the world. And at its best, you have to figure out where your targets are, how to trigger them to show up, and then they're reskins of monsters you've already faced, or unique monsters in some cases, and they all have different abilities that make them a challenge outside of regular combat. Final Fantasy XII is an enormous game and easily probably one of the longest in the entire series, with the most to do outside of the main story. While it had a less than stellar reception upon release, the subsequent years have been kind to Final Fantasy XII, and the Zodiac Age re-release largely fixed a lot of the problems that took 12 from a very niche game that not many would recommend to being a really solid sleeper contender for one of the best in the series. Now this, in my opinion, is where the dark ages for Final Fantasy really settled in. 12 didn't have the best reception upon release, and 13 really had a lot of weight and expectation on its shoulders before it came out, and it really didn't meet those at all. 13 is easily the weakest in the series since 5, and arguably the worst in the franchise. For me, the story just fell super flat, and the characters lacked the heart and soul from previous entries. It just felt like a mess, and honestly, I would not recommend this for anyone unless you're trying to play and complete the entire franchise. That includes 13.2 and 13.3. None of these games are particularly fun to play, and they are just a hot mess narratively. There are some redeeming moments here and there, and the music is pretty good, but there are just so many other better titles for you to invest your time in. And while recent years have been kind to the spin-offs of 13, it is still the black sheep of the Final Fantasy franchise. Final Fantasy XIV came out a year later and bombed. Very famously, they had to remake the entire game because of how broken it was. And then it was 6 years later that we got Final Fantasy XV, and by this point, the entire series had lost some of its luster. Final Fantasy XV had a lot of expectations on it, as it really had to save the franchise in a lot of ways. And with its long development time and change of what it was going to be, it was a mess upon first reception. Final Fantasy XV was very different and showcased another side of Final Fantasy, and a lot of people just wanted them to go back to basics. However, over the years past initial release, the reception has been a lot kinder to Final Fantasy XV, and it has a very special place in everyone's hearts. It's not the best game in the series, but it does have a lot of heart and spunk for it, and does punch above its weight class for what it is. And while a lot of people would probably point to it as something to start with because it's the newest Final Fantasy, I cannot recommend that because of how different it is. And I did enjoy playing it. It is not representative of what Final Fantasy is, and definitely should be played, but should not be played first. So that leads us to our final question. Out of all of these games, which one should you play first? And again, it's not an easy question, and I don't really think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. At the end of the day, I think there are two Final Fantasy games that I would point to and recommend to people first. And while they may or may not be the best in the series, they do represent a lot of the best parts of Final Fantasy at the end of the day. I again want to reiterate that I'm not recommending 6 or 7 because I don't think they could ever meet the hype of somebody coming into the series for the first time. 6 is widely regarded as a masterpiece. 7 is probably one of the most played Final Fantasies of all time. You're inevitably going to have your opinion colored of those games. And in 7's regard, you probably already know a few of the major story beats, so you will be taken back from it in some regards. So while those games are probably better picks overall, as someone who's first getting into those titles, if you played them first and they didn't live up to the hype, or you played them and you loved them, would any of the other titles live up to those titles? And I think that's something to maintain as a thought when recommending getting into the entire series. Now that I've got that disclaimer out of the way, I can finally tell you which games I recommend. The first one is Final Fantasy IV. It is far and away the blueprint of what Final Fantasy is at every level. Though 3 games did come before it, this is truly where the franchise found its roots and foundation. Final Fantasy IV gives you the perfect introduction to the entire series and is a perfect jumping off point for further exploration. I highly recommend playing the 3DS remake, as it has voice acting and has balance tuning that really makes it a pleasurable, fun experience that is true to the first iteration while not being unnecessarily easy or difficult. On the other side of the spectrum is Final Fantasy X. It's modern and super easy to pick up and play. It's fully voice acted, and the HD remaster is basically available on every gaming platform these days. The story is deep and engaging, the characters are well fleshed out, and go through a well-defined arc that weaves through the story. The combat is my absolute favorite in any RPG I've ever played. It's simplistic, and at its heart, it's as simple as rock, paper, scissors. But there's a lot of robust options, and it creates a landscape where all party members are useful. And let us not forget, it has one of the most recognizable music scores in the history of gaming. So there you have it. Those are my 2 recommendations for which game to start with. It wasn't an easy choice, and I ultimately went with 2 games because I don't think there is one size fits all. But between 4 and 10, I felt those games represented the most of Final Fantasy at different points of the series' life. And so while you may not like 10, you may love 4, and vice versa. Final Fantasy is all about dialing in what aspects of the series you really like. You're not expected to like every game in the series. I know I don't. I have favorites, and I have games that I don't really like as much. So figure out what you like in games, and I'm certain at least one game in the Final Fantasy series will catch your eye. Let me know what you think about my recommendations in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. What was your first Final Fantasy game? And what would you recommend to the people who ask you, what Final Fantasy game should I start with?